I want to start this by saying something clearly, because people love to misinterpret silence as loyalty and criticism as hatred. I was never on anyone's side except the side of what was right. Not content creators, not opportunists, not personalities, and not even the family as a whole when the facts didn't support it. I was always focused on the most vulnerable people in this situation and whether they were actually being protected or just being used. Now that Patrick has been arrested, the internet has done what it always does. It picked teams, it picked villains, it picked heroes, and it started rewriting history in real time. Some people are acting shocked. Others are acting like they saw it coming all along. But if you strip the noise away, what's left is something much simpler and much uglier. This didn't fall apart because of one mistake. It fell apart because multiple people believed they could operate in plain sight without consequences. Patrick believed it would go unseen. Eric believed it would go unseen. And for a while, they were right. That's the part people don't want to admit. For months, money was moving. Content was being monetized. Lives were being broadcast. Contracts were being discussed. Cash apps were being promoted. And everyone involved believed they were smart enough to keep it just clean enough, just confusing enough that nobody would ever fully untangle it. But here's the thing about money and vulnerable people. The more you mix them, the more attention you attract. Not from viewers, from systems, from agencies, from people whose entire job is to look for patterns that don't make sense. And this pattern didn't make sense. I've said this before, and I'll say it again now that one of them is sitting in jail. The biggest mistake wasn't filming. It wasn't visiting. It wasn't even monetizing content. The moment everything went wrong was when control replaced transparency. When money stopped being simple. When agreements stopped being clear. When contracts entered a space where no one should have been signing anything without independent protection. That's where this turned from messy into criminal. People keep asking whether Patrick was overcharged, whether the felonies will stick, whether this would get pled down. And legally, sure, there are arguments to be made. Amounts matter. Intent matters. Cooperation matters. But morally, the question is already answered. You don't build an income stream around people who cannot fully understand what's being built around them. You don't decide for yourself how much they deserve from their own story. You don't turn human beings into a brand and then act surprised when the law asks where the money went. This is where people start getting uncomfortable because it forces them to look at things they supported, videos they watched, links they clicked, money they sent, and they want it to be clean. They want it to be simple. They want one bad guy, so they can move on. But that's not how this works. Patrick didn't operate alone. Eric didn't operate in a vacuum. And the system didn't suddenly wake up one day out of nowhere. This built slowly, quietly, and very publicly. There's a reason why the charges are what they are. Intellectual disability is a protected class. That's not emotional language. That's legal reality. When you're dealing with people who are considered unable to fully advocate for themselves, the threshold for criminal liability drops fast. What might be questionable with one group becomes prosecutable with another. And that's why this case didn't stay in internet drama territory. That's why it crossed into state police involvement. That's why one person is sitting in a cell right now wondering how everything spiraled so quickly. People keep saying, well, Eric hasn't been arrested. That's true, so far. But lack of arrest does not equal lack of involvement. And anyone who's paid attention to how these cases unfold knows that cooperation often determines who gets charged first, who gets charged later, and who doesn't get charged at all. I'm not saying anything is fact beyond what's public. I'm saying this is pattern recognition. When one person goes down and another walks away clean, it's rarely because only one person touched the mess. It's because someone helped explain it. And that's where this story gets even darker. Because while people online argue about who deserves jail time, the family itself has been shattered. 3 people removed. 2 left behind, silence enforced, contact restricted, and the public still arguing as if this is a YouTube feud instead of a real investigation with real consequences. This is not entertainment anymore. This is a case study in what happens when vulnerability meets monetization without guardrails. If Patrick had set this up differently, if there had been flat fees, clear payments, third-party oversight, transparent accounting, none of this would be happening right now. That's not speculation. That's reality. Plenty of channels pay interviewees. Plenty of content creators compensate subjects ethically. That model exists for a reason. But greed changes math. When you start believing you deserve more than the people whose lives you're profiting from, you stop protecting yourself. You stop protecting them. And eventually, you get noticed. That's where we are now. Patrick is arrested. Eric is quiet. The family is separated. And the internet is pretending this came out of nowhere. It didn't. And the hardest question hasn't even been answered yet. Why are Betty and Larry still being kept away from their siblings? Is it about safety? Is it about evidence? Is it about control? Or is it about the fallout from a scheme that went further than anyone wants to admit? That's what we're going to get into next. But before that, I want you to sit with this and answer honestly. Do you think Patrick and Eric believed they would never be held accountable? Comment below and tell me what you think. Once you move past the arrest headlines and the Facebook arguments, you're left with something much heavier than a debate about guilt. You're left with a timeline. And timelines don't lie the way people do. This didn't unravel overnight. It unraveled in stages, each one small enough to explain away at the time, each one justifiable if you didn't look too closely. That's how situations like this survive for as long as they do. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to exploit a vulnerable family. What happens instead is rationalization layered on top of access, layered on top of money, layered on top of control. The first stage was visibility. Once the family became content, everything changed. Not just for viewers, but for the people closest to them. Visibility brings attention, and attention creates perceived value. Suddenly, their daily lives weren't just routines. They were assets. Moments became clips. Interactions became monetizable. And the more people watched, the easier it became for outsiders to believe they were doing something important simply by being there. The second stage was proximity. When someone inserts themselves into a vulnerable household and becomes familiar enough to be trusted, boundaries start to blur. Helping turns into deciding. Deciding turns into managing. Managing turns into control. And control, when unchecked, becomes ownership in the mind of the person exercising it. This is where things stopped being about helping and started being about authority. Who decides how the money is handled? Who decides what gets filmed? Who decides what the family needs? Who decides what the audience is allowed to see? Those questions matter more than people realize, because whoever answers them holds power. And power doesn't need a contract to exist. It just needs silence from the people who should be protected. The third stage was monetization without structure. This is where everything went sideways. Money started flowing in ways that weren't centralized, weren't transparent, and weren't accountable. Multiple platforms, multiple payment apps, multiple narratives, and no single, clean paper trail that clearly showed how funds were divided, how decisions were made, or who was responsible when something went wrong. That alone should have stopped everything. But it didn't, because greed convinces people they're smarter than consequences. People keep asking why this didn't get shut down earlier. The answer is simple. As long as everyone involved believed they were benefiting, nobody wanted to ask questions. Viewers felt good because they were helping. Creators felt justified because they were raising awareness. and the family was caught in the middle, unable to fully understand the machinery built around them. That's not consent. That's exposure. Then came the contracts. This is the point of no return. You do not put contracts in front of people who do not have independent representation, especially when those contracts involve money, image rights, or long-term obligations. That's not gray area. That's reckless at best and predatory at worst. Once contracts enter the picture, intent stops being theoretical. The law doesn't care how friendly someone seemed on camera. It cares about who benefited, who signed what, and whether the people signing understood what they were agreeing to. And here's what people keep ignoring. Even if the family verbally agreed to things, verbal agreement does not override capacity concerns. If someone lacks the ability to fully understand the scope and consequences of an agreement, the agreement itself becomes suspect. That's not opinion. That's legal principle. This is why the protected class designation matters so much. When a law sees intellectual disability, it doesn't just see vulnerability. It sees obligation. It places a higher burden on anyone interacting financially with that person. The responsibility shifts. The margin for error shrinks, and the excuses disappear. This is why Patrick's charges aren't just about fraud. They're about exploitation. And exploitation isn't defined by how much someone smiles on camera. It's defined by imbalance. Who knew more? Who controlled more? Who gained more? Now let's talk about Eric, because this is where emotions start boiling over. Some people want him arrested immediately. Others defend him like he's untouchable. Both sides are missing the point. The question isn't whether he's been charged yet. The question is what role he played when things started collapsing. Eric didn't just show up and leave quietly. He made moves. He called agencies. He escalated situations. He positioned himself as someone with solutions while simultaneously describing the environment as unsafe. That contradiction matters. If things were unsafe enough to require repeated agency involvement, why was it acceptable to monetize content there for months? If things were fine enough to film and profit from, why were ultimatums suddenly necessary? You can't have it both ways. Either the environment was too dangerous to exist in, or it was safe enough to generate income from. The moment someone tries to use both narratives, depending on what benefits them, credibility starts to crack. And credibility is everything when investigations begin. This is where I believe the cooperation question becomes unavoidable. Not as an accusation, but as a logical possibility. In cases like this, authorities don't just stumble into clarity. They build it. They ask questions. They follow money. They look for inconsistencies. And sometimes, one person decides it's better to talk than to fall. That doesn't make someone innocent. It makes them strategic. Meanwhile, the family itself was collapsing quietly. While viewers were arguing and creators were posting, the most vulnerable members were being evaluated. Homes were being assessed. Risks were being documented. And eventually, the state stepped in. Not because of one video, not because of one phone call, but because the entire situation had become unstable. That's the part nobody wants to face. The arrest didn't cause the removal. The removal didn't cause the investigation. They all grew out of the same failure to protect. And now we're here. Patrick is locked up, at least for now. Eric is silent. The money is being questioned. And the family is separated under conditions they don't control. People want this to be a morality play with a clean ending. One villain punished, one hero vindicated, and a family restored. But real life doesn't work that way, especially when systems get involved. The system doesn't care about YouTube narratives. It cares about risk, liability, and precedent. And here's the part one need people to understand. Even if Patrick's charges are reduced, even if Eric is never charged, even if restitution is ordered, the damage is already done. Trust is gone. Privacy is gone. And the family's future is now being decided by people they didn't choose. That's the cost of believing something would go unseen. Before we move on, I want you to think about this carefully and answer honestly. At what point does help become control? Comment below and tell me where you think the line was crossed. Now we have to talk about the part everyone keeps dancing around, because this is where discomfort lives. Not in the arrest, not in the charges, not even in the money. The real issue is influence. Who shaped the outcome before the system ever stepped in? Because what happened to this family didn't start with a jail cell. It started with narrative control. Once a story becomes public, whoever controls the narrative controls perception. And perception influences action. That includes viewers, donors, agencies, and yes, authorities. When enough noise is created around a situation, the system doesn't step in calmly. It steps in cautiously, defensively, and often aggressively. That matters here. The Whittaker household existed in the same condition for decades. Decades. The state didn't suddenly discover it in 2025. Neighbors didn't suddenly realize it existed. The difference wasn't the house. It was the attention. Once cameras arrived, once money started moving, once accusations and counter-accusations filled the air, the family stopped being invisible. And invisibility, as harsh as it sounds, had been their shield. When that shield disappeared, scrutiny replaced it. And scrutiny doesn't come alone. It brings judgment. This is where responsibility becomes shared, even if guilt does not. Error didn't have to be malicious to be harmful. Patrick didn't have to intend prison to cause damage. And the audience didn't have to mean harm to contribute to it. That's what makes this story so dangerous. Everyone involved can point to a moment where they believe they were doing the right thing. But intentions don't erase outcomes. Let's talk about escalation. Calling agencies once is concern. Calling repeatedly is pressure. Publicly framing the situation as dire, while privately monetizing it as contradiction. When someone positions themselves as both savior and whistleblower, it muddies everything. Because now the question becomes, are you protecting the family or protecting yourself? Once agencies are involved, the threshold changes. The home is no longer judged against its own history. It's judged against regulations, risk assessments, and liability frameworks. And the moment the state believes it could be blamed for inaction, removal becomes the safest option for them. That doesn't mean it's the best option for the family. This is where people misunderstand the system. Adult Protective Services doesn't operate on morality. It operates on risk mitigation. If a vulnerable adult is deemed unsafe and the environment is unstable, the safest legal move is separation. Even if that separation causes emotional harm. Even if it fractures a family that survived together for decades. The system chooses liability reduction over continuity. Now add this layer. When money is involved, everything becomes radioactive. Once there are allegations of financial exploitation, especially involving a protected class, the state's posture shifts again. Now it's not just about safety. It's about evidence. Preserving it. Preventing further exploitation. Cutting off access. Restricting communication. That explains a lot of what people don't understand right now. Why Betty and Larry can't get answers. Why contact is limited or non-existent. Why nobody will confirm where the others are. It isn't cruelty, it's containment. But containment feels like punishment when you're the one locked out. Now, let's address something uncomfortable that viewers rarely admit. The audience played a role, not because they watched, not because they cared, but because attention became currency. Views created leverage. Donations created pressure. Outrage created urgency. And urgency is the fastest way to make bad decisions look necessary. People demanded updates. People demanded access. People demanded proof. And in that environment, calm solutions don't survive. That pressure cooker didn't just affect creators. It affected the family. It affected agencies. It affected everyone watching from the outside who suddenly felt entitled to answers. And entitlement is the enemy of protection. This is where the idea of they would have been fine if left alone becomes complicated. Would the family still be together? Probably. Would the house still be unsafe? Likely. Would they still be invisible? Yes. Invisibility protected them from exploitation, but it also protected neglect. Both can be true at the same time. That's the moral paradox nobody wants to sit with. The intervention didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a storm created by content, money, control, and collapse. Now I need to talk about BJ, because avoiding that conversation is dishonest. BJ's situation is not separate from this story. It's a consequence of it. When a family loses its internal balance, when outside forces disrupt long-standing roles, chaos fills the gap. Asking for money in that environment doesn't automatically make someone a villain, but it does raise serious concerns, especially when sobriety, stability, and accountability are unclear. People sending money aren't just donating. They're enabling decisions. And when those decisions involve legal matters, housing, or attempts to reunite a family, the risks multiply. Good intentions don't replace capacity. This is why I've said repeatedly, no individual in this situation should be handling funds without oversight. Not BJ, not Eric, not Patrick, not anyone. Money should have gone one place, with one ledger, under one transparent structure. That didn't happen, and now everyone is paying for it. Here's the hardest truth of part 3. The family didn't lose control because of one bad actor. They lost control because too many people believed control was theirs to take. Creators believed it. Viewers believed it. Agencies enforced it. And the family was never given the tools to protect themselves from any of it. Now ask yourself this. If Patrick had never monetized, would Eric have escalated? If Eric had never escalated, would the state have intervened when it did? If the state hadn't intervened, would the family still be together? There are no clean answers, only consequences. And this is why the idea that someone won or lost here is absurd. Patrick lost his freedom. Eric lost credibility. The family lost each other. Nobody walked. Should the state have stepped in sooner or not at all? Comment below and tell me why. This is the part most people don't want to hear because it removes comfort and replaces it with reality. Once the system steps in at this level, things do not go back to normal. There is no reset button, no rewind. No, once this clears up, they all go home. That belief is one of the most dangerous myths still floating around this story, and it's keeping people emotionally stuck in the wrong place. So let's talk about what the future actually looks like once adult protective services, law enforcement, and the courts are all involved at the same time. First, reunification. People throw that word around like it's a guarantee. It isn't. Reunification is a goal in some cases, not an outcome in most. Especially when the adults involved are elderly, cognitively impaired, or medically fragile. Especially when the home itself has already been deemed unsafe. Especially when there is an open fraud investigation connected to the household. Reunification requires several things to happen at once, not eventually, but concurrently. The environment must be demonstrably safe. Care must be consistent, documented, and verifiable. Finances must be clean, transparent, and supervised. There must be no active risk of exploitation. That's not an emotional checklist. That's a legal one. Now ask yourself honestly, who, right now, is in a position to provide all of that? Betty and Larry are elderly. They are grieving. They are isolated. They're being monitored. Even if their intentions are pure, capacity matters more than love in the eyes of the system. BJ may want to help, but wanting is not the same as being qualified. Stability, sobriety, housing, and legal standing matter. The system does not operate on promises. It operates on proof. And outsiders? They are no longer an option at all. Not after what already happened. Which brings us to the hard truth. The system does not see the Whittaker family as a single unit anymore. It sees individuals with separate risk profiles. That's a quiet but devastating shift. Timmy is not evaluated as part of a family. Ray is not evaluated as part of a household. Lorraine is not evaluated as part of a group. They are evaluated independently. And once that happens, keeping them together is no longer the priority. Safety is. That doesn't mean they're being mistreated. It means emotional continuity has been deprioritized in favor of medical, legal, and structural stability. This is where people get angry and say, but they lived together their whole lives. Yes, and that history is acknowledged emotionally, but it doesn't outweigh present risk legally. That's how the system works. Cold, procedural, unforgiving. Now let's talk about contact, because this is where confusion turns into resentment. Why can't Betty and Larry just call? Why can't they visit? Why won't anyone tell them where the others are? Because once an investigation touches exploitation, access becomes evidence sensitive. Phone calls can be influenced. Visits can be coercive. Information can leak. The system assumes risk by default, even if no one intends harm, especially when the people involved are considered a protected class. This is the part that feels cruel, but it isn't personal. It's procedural. The state does not trust anyone in the original environment until everything is resolved. And that resolution doesn't happen quickly. Which brings us to time. People think arrests bring closure. They don't. They bring delay. Once charges are filed, everything slows down. Agencies stop making permanent decisions. Courts pause. Caseworkers wait. Because once someone is charged, anything done before the legal dust settles can be challenged later. So while people online are screaming for answers, the system is doing the opposite. It's freezing. That's why silence feels so loud right now. Now let's talk about the house, because this is where the future becomes very uncomfortable. The house is not just a place. It's a liability. Unsafe conditions plus elderly occupants plus reduced household size equals escalating risk. With fewer people inside, there are fewer safeguards, fewer witnesses, fewer checks and balances. If something happens to one of them, the other is immediately vulnerable. From the state's perspective, this is not a stable endpoint. It's a waiting room, and waiting rooms lead somewhere. Either additional support is introduced under strict supervision, or the remaining residents are eventually evaluated for placement as well. That's the fork in the road. People don't like hearing that, but pretending otherwise doesn't protect anyone. Now we need to address accountability without scapegoating. Patrick being arrested does not undo the harm. Eric not being arrested does not erase responsibility. The state intervening does not mean the family is safe forever. Each action triggered another. And the biggest mistake people keep making is assuming the system is designed to heal families. It isn't. It's designed to prevent liability and reduce risk. Healing is incidental, not guaranteed. That's why so many families experience state intervention as loss rather than help. Because while safety might increase, autonomy disappears. Now here's the most important shift people need to make if they actually care about the Whittakers' future. Stop asking, when will they be back together? Start asking, how do we prevent further harm? That means no more unauthorized fundraising. No more self-appointed saviors. No more forcing narratives onto people who cannot consent. And most importantly, no more pressure. Pressure is what started this spiral. Pressure is what accelerated intervention. Pressure is what keeps the system defensive. The safest thing right now is boring stability. No drama. No money movement. No public stunts. Just quiet compliance while the legal process plays out. And that's the part people hate. Because quiet doesn't feel like caring. It feels like abandonment. But in situations like this, quiet can be protection. In Part 5, we're going to talk about responsibility going forward. Not blame. Responsibility. Who needs to step back? Who needs to step up? And what ethical support actually looks like now that the damage is done. Before you move on, I want you to answer this honestly. If keeping the family together means keeping them unsafe, is separation still wrong? Comment below. This is where responsibility finally replaces outrage. Not blame, not theories, not sides. Responsibility. Because at this stage of the story, pointing fingers does nothing for the people still living inside the consequences. What matters now is who steps back, who stays silent, and who understands that help no longer looks like access. The Whittaker family is no longer a public story in the way people became accustomed to. That chapter closed the moment law enforcement and adult protective services stepped in simultaneously. From that point forward, this stopped being an internet narrative and became a controlled legal environment. And controlled environments don't tolerate freelancing. That's the first reality people need to accept. No more intermediaries. No more, I'm just trying to help. No more personal channels, private cash apps, or emotional appeals framed as emergencies. Those things are not neutral anymore. They are potential violations. Anyone who truly cares about Betty and Larry right now should be advocating for less visibility, not more. Less noise, less speculation, less pressure on two elderly people who are already being evaluated under a microscope. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The next intervention won't be triggered by neglect alone. It will be triggered by instability. Instability includes strangers showing up, money changing hands without oversight, conflicting narratives online, emotional distress caused by public scrutiny. Every one of those things works against the people still in the home. And this is where the internet struggles because it confuses involvement with importance. You don't have to be involved to matter. You don't have to be visible to help. You don't have to be loud to be ethical. In fact, the loudest voices right now are the most dangerous. Now let's talk about what ethical support actually looks like in 2026. Ethical support respects boundaries. Ethical support does not demand updates. Ethical support does not require access. Ethical support means trusting that professionals, not creators, not commenters, not self-appointed advocates, are responsible for safety decisions. And yes, that trust is hard when the system feels cold. But the alternative has already shown its consequences. People keep asking, why can't Betty and Larry just be told everything? Because information creates leverage. And leverage, even when unintentional, can be used to influence vulnerable people. The system's job right now is not to soothe curiosity. It's to prevent further harm. That includes emotional harm. Which brings us to the hardest part of this entire story. Love does not always mean proximity. For decades, this family survived through closeness, through routine, through familiarity, through shared space. That worked until it didn't. When conditions reached a point where safety could no longer be maintained, closeness became risk, and the system responded accordingly. That doesn't make the family bad. It doesn't make Betty cruel. It doesn't make Larry complicit. It makes the situation unmanageable without intervention. And now, the goal is not restoration of the past. The goal is prevention of further collapse. People need to stop romanticizing how things were. The porch, the routines, the sameness. Those things felt comforting from the outside, but they existed alongside untreated medical issues, environmental hazards, and increasing vulnerability. Nostalgia is not a care plan. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Accountability does not end with one arrest. Patrick being arrested does not close the book. It opens a record. There are still unanswered questions, still investigations, still civil implications that may take months or years to resolve. And during that time, the Whittakers are not props in a morality play. They are individuals whose lives are being reshaped by decisions they didn't fully control. That's why restraint matters now more than outrage ever did. If you're a creator, the ethical move is to stop escalating. If you're a donor, the ethical move is to stop sending money. If you're a viewer, the ethical move is to stop demanding access. Silence is not abandonment when silence prevents harm. Now here's the part people rarely consider. What happens if Betty or Larry decline? What happens if one of them gets sick, falls, needs hospitalization? Those moments are when the system reassesses everything. And what it sees at that moment will determine the future. A calm, quiet environment with no external interference strengthens the case for autonomy. Chaos weakens it. Every comment, every rumor, every breaking update adds weight to the argument that the environment is unstable. So if you truly want Betty and Larry to remain together, to retain any control over their lives, to avoid further removals, the answer is not action. The answer is restraint. Now I want to be clear about one thing. This does not mean ignoring injustice. It does not mean excusing exploitation. It does not mean forgetting what happened. It means choosing the right battlefield. The legal system is already handling accountability. Your role is not to amplify it emotionally. Your role is to not interfere with it. There will be a time for answers. There will be a time for records. There will be a time for transparency. This is not that time. This is the stabilization phase. And stabilization is boring. It's quiet. It feels unsatisfying, but it saves lives. The biggest mistake people can make right now is assuming silence means nothing is happening. Silence means the system is working carefully. Finally, let's talk about dignity. For the first time in this entire saga, the Whittakers are not being filmed, monetized, dissected, or paraded. They are being protected from the very thing that once brought help. That matters. And whether you agree with how it happened or not, the outcome is something the internet rarely allows vulnerable people: privacy. So here's the final question, and it matters more than any theory or accusation. If protecting someone means stepping back instead of stepping in, are you willing to do that? Leave your answer below. And if you truly care about this family, let this be the moment where care finally looks like restraint. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.